Are we live? Good, great. All right, well, it's great to see all of you here as we get ready to step into the new session together. Every year, the Joint Fiscal Office organizes this briefing to help prepare us for the work ahead by providing updates on Vermont revenues, budgetary pressures, and overviews of some of the major issues that will shape our work this year. Today is about giving all of us the same foundation before we begin our work in January. Vermonters are looking to the legislature with real questions around affordability, schools, housing, healthcare, and more. Here's how the day will go. First, we'll hear from Tom Kvet, our economic and revenue outlook. Then we will hear a budget presentation from JFO's Emily Byrne and Logan Muberry. After that, Marcia Howard, Executive Director of the Federal Funds Information for States, will walk us through what's happening at the federal level and the impacts on Vermont. We will then break for lunch and then come back for updates on education funding from Julia Richter of JFO. We will end the day with a panel discussion on the state of healthcare in Vermont. It's a full agenda, and I want to thank the Joint Fiscal staff for their dedication and expertise to support all of our legislative work. We could truly not do our jobs without them, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for the way they show up for us year after year. Thank you to the staff. I also want to thank all of our presenters for taking time out of their busy lives to be here today. Please help me thank them later on during those presentations. But before we jump into the presentations, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the reality Vermonters are living in right now. People are worried about the cost of keeping a roof over their heads. They're frustrated by the political discourse in Congress. They're struggling with the healthcare system that is often inaccessible and unaffordable when they need it. And they're worried about the future of our education system and what the future holds for our Vermont kids and the cost to educate them. These aren't abstract policy challenges. These are kitchen table questions that affect every family we represent. And Vermonters have entrusted us to take those questions seriously and to do the work to make their lives a little easier. We are walking into a session that will require collaboration, discipline, and a lot of honest conversations across differing opinions and ideas. We've been fortunate to have the summer and fall to take time to meet our neighbors and hear what is and what isn't working in our communities. And while all of our communities are unique, many of the challenges facing Vermonters cross district lines and geographic divides. We've been hearing and learning from the successes of the pain points from our previous work and have the knowledge and the lessons learned to move forward to meet the moment before us. I truly believe we have an opportunity to make thoughtful changes that will help Vermonters in all 14 counties. I'm grateful to do this work alongside all of you, and I'm proud of the way we continue to lead with respect, collaboration, and a constant focus on Vermonters who trusted us to be here and to do this work. And with that, I will turn it over to Senator Baru. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning. Welcome back. Before I say what little I have to say, I just wanted to second my thanks to the staff, particularly JFO, for putting this together. We have the best staff in the world, and you know that as well as I do. It's always good to feel everyone coming together again, to feel our shared commitment and shared strength in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in this chamber, and in the Senate chamber just around the corner. But it's especially good to feel that gathering strength this year because we will need every bit of it and more this coming session. Last year, we were facing multiple crises and emergencies simultaneously. Our hospitals and our health insurers were showing real signs of strain, even in some cases, signs of potential collapse. Our property taxes had spiked and then spiked again. We were still dealing with the long-term effects of catastrophic flooding. And all of these crises are still with us this year in one form or another. But as we gather today, there is a larger emergency looming, a more all-encompassing crisis that we will all of us confront this time out. And as unbelievable as it may sound, or as it might have sounded to us a dozen years ago, that crisis is being produced on a daily basis by our own federal government. Last year, we were worried about what might come to pass following the 2024 elections. This year, we know all too well the on-the-ground realities. The federal government has tried its best to withhold money from SNAP and LIHEAP. The federal government has denied our urgent requests for disaster aid assistance. Just think for a second about what those denials mean. These are not frills or perks or waste or fraud or abuse, not by any stretch of the imagination. Washington has tried to keep food from the poorest among us, and they've tried to eliminate heating assistance for those most at risk in the middle of winter. And maybe worst of all, they've begun a process of picking and choosing who will receive aid in the wake of a natural disaster, with the bluest states looking not just at delay, but at outright denial and disregard, and that regardless of economic impact, regardless of how many in those states will live or die. But the loss of federal funding is only the half of it. The federal government now reserves the right to send masked agents into our streets to detain and imprison our constituents, in some cases regardless of American citizenship or legal status. They are threatening to punish Vermont and states like it for protecting the civil rights of all its citizens. Even as we speak, two of my constituents, a Winooski mother and her second-grade child, are being held in a detention facility in Dilley, Texas. The horrible irony is that this family moved to Vermont because of our reputation for welcoming immigrants and treating them with kindness and decency. So that is the question, the main question on my mind as we enter this session. How will we respond to these provocations and outrages? Will we fight for the rights of those targeted by this federal administration? Will we close the inevitable gaps in funding to make sure that our people eat, that our people survive the winter? Will we push back in our bills, in our votes, in our committees, in our several political caucuses, because this is not a partisan issue? We will all need to fight, Republicans, Democrats, and progressives. Will we push back against this attempt to bend Vermont to a cruel federal will? I believe we will. I believe we will push back again and again in all the legal ways open to us. Our Attorney General is demonstrating that every day. But make no mistake, this session will be more like a horror movie than a Hallmark holiday film. Because although emergencies and crises are our stock in trade, this time the call is coming from inside the House. And history will judge how we all respond. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Welcome to the annual all-member briefing. It is so nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. As always, the goal of this briefing is to provide you with vital information and context for the upcoming legislative session. As a nonpartisan office, our role is to support your policy decisions by providing objective analyses. You make the decisions. Our responsibility is ensuring those decisions are informed by sound and fiscal analysis and that our state maintains strong fiscal health. Over the course of the day, you're going to hear from legislative staff and other experts. We'll start in the morning with big picture, and then in the afternoon, we'll go to some more specific details. We plan to have a Q&A at the end of each session. And we have a lot to get through, so we may not get to every question. You can, if you don't get your question answered, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can send your emails to askjfo@ledge.state.vt.us. We're going to start the morning with Tom Gavett, the legislative economist, who will share his firm's analysis of Vermont's economy and revenue review. Thank you all for being here today. Tom.
Is this working? Yep.
Yeah,
Good.
Tom, I'm going to say one more quick thing. We have, all of these handouts are on the webpage. There are also a few hard copies down here, but they are all posted on the JFO page. And if you can't find it, email Ask JFO and we can send you the link.
Working on the PowerPoint. Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you all for braving the weather to get here. I know the roads were not too good if you were driving from far away, but it's a great start to the winter ski season, and we need it, and it should help Meals and Rooms revenues. So cold enough to make snow, and really nice snow for skiing out there right now. I want to just cut right to the chase with respect to where we're standing on revenues right now. And boy, I don't know why that's invisible on the slide, but the general fund, that little box to the left, should say plus 1.5% in the handouts. You can see that. So this is through October. We have some early November data, but it's preliminary, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you add all those funds together, general fund, transportation fund, and education fund, not including the property tax part of the education fund, which is traditionally what we're looking at here, it's almost spot on more than $1 billion in target revenue. We're ahead by 8 million, so that's 0.7%. That's pretty much spot on. So aggregate revenues are performing just about like expected. That's good. But there is some fraying around the edges and some things that cause concern, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But so far, it's looking good. The transportation fund is weaker. The number on that, if you look on the box, year to date is 2.3% below, and the education fund is 0.1, pretty much spot on. So you can see from those bars, they pretty much line up, the actual being the green bar and the target level, the red bar. So revenues to date are good, but there are certainly some challenges. November data is weird because November was an unusual month in that there was a holiday right before a weekend at the close of the month, which meant that people were filing, who were mailing stuff in. The money wasn't being recorded as it would have been if there was a working day as the last day of the month. So you had a combination of 2 days holiday and then 2 days of the weekend, and it artificially depressed November results. If we look at November revenues, it doesn't tell a radically different story. It flips it a teeny bit negative instead of a teeny bit positive, but I suspect we'll make all of that up or most of it in December. So that's just a timing issue. And so nothing there that's of concern. The thing that did hit in November is we got more in the way of corporate refunds than expected. We always get a certain amount of corporate refunds, but they're what we call cash out refunds. So a lot of times if corporations or individuals overpay, they'll apply that money to future liabilities, so they don't necessarily ask for a check. We're seeing more companies asking for checks, which means they don't expect to have the kind of liabilities that they had in the previous tax payment period. So those sort of things are little signals that we get about, what's kind of going on underneath the sheet, so to speak. I have to do these, so let me just. Yeah, this is all in the handout, so you can see it. That's the general revenues. Oh, just a word on the meals and rooms, which was light through October, down both in the general fund and the education fund, because that gets split. And we've seen a pretty pronounced decline in Canadian visitation. And these are just some latest stats year to date from the visitor centers that are proximate to Canada, nearby Canada, and then, if you add those together, I'm calling that Canadian prevalent. Overall visitation is down 9%, but for those right on the Canadian border, 36% lower visitation, and nearby 18% lower. So that's not helping meals and rooms revenues, and that's probably explains the little bit of variance. We expected there to be, some drop off, but this is bigger than we would have anticipated. And I say needless just because you can apply tariffs on whoever you want, but if you want to rub it in somebody's face and nose, you're going to get reactions like this, and that just doesn't help when it comes to revenue that we're wanting and needing. The other thing, this presentation has fewer slides than usual because we haven't had data for 2 months, at least 3 months for some categories. And so the factual basis upon which we do all our analytic work are federal government and state government numbers, and we are just lacking a lot of that information. So our ability to peek around the corner is based on that, and quite often we get data that is non-intuitive. You look at a number and you say, oh, well, everybody's saying this, but the data is different. And that's what we go on. We don't go on all the hearsay. When we see factual data, we quantify it, and we have to quantify then how much money we're getting for the state, and whether you're going to have a problem with not enough money or you're going to have extra money, you can do things that you didn't think you could do. So not having these critical reads on what's happening has been a problem, but it'll shorten the presentation a little bit and maybe leave more time for question and answer at the end of it. There are two really powerful cross currents that are shaping the economic environment right now. One is a really powerful tailwind associated with artificial intelligence investment. It's just absolutely staggering amounts of money that are going into this. It's really unprecedented in scope, scale, and timing. And if these bets are right, there could be revolutionary changes in lots of industries and lots of economic benefits. If these bets are wrong, or if their timing's off a little bit, or the magnitude of it is off, it's also a great vulnerability because there are very few players in the space and enormous amounts of money that the economy is highly dependent on right now. It is also what's driving the run-up in stock market growth. So, this is total S&P 500, and an enormous percentage of that over the last 3 years or so, as much as 75% of that has been tech stocks that are related to AI. So it's a phenomenal amount of actual spending on the ground. It's affecting wealth through the stock market. It's a big part of what's keeping the economy moving forward right now. And so that's a critical tailwind. We're also facing headwinds, and those headwinds have to do with deglobalization, primarily the tariffs, and also immigration policy. So those two things are headwinds that are reducing growth relative to potential, and those are the kind of the forces that are at play. What it's meant in terms of how people experience the economy is that if you're in the stock market, if you're invested, if you're a part of that world, you are doing really well. And more than half of all consumer spending now is coming from the highest 10% of income earners. So there's a real dependency on spending and what's happening in the economy on the high end. At the bottom end, the 50% of the population that owns about 1% of all the stocks, you're not feeling anything from this. You're seeing prices go up, and the world is very different. So there's a real bifurcation in the experience. That's not new. There's been this sort of thing before, but it's exacerbating that inequality, and that's why you can get radically different takes on what's happening in the economy. We're interested in how they flow through to tax receipts, so that's those are stories unto themselves. You'll see the impact of tariffs in a lot of data series when they're announced in April, and consumer sentiment tanks, and a lot of things are disrupted by that. I think the erratic nature of the tariffs is as problematic as the actual level. They're going to be sort of one-time price shocks, but they're flowing through in a fairly disjoint way, where initially there was a lot of advanced inventory that was shipped to the United States, so prices didn't show up right away. And then the wholesalers and retailers have been eating a fairly high percentage of the price. That's not going to go on forever. Any business that has market power is eventually going to pass those prices on. They'll be felt. They're already being felt in some areas. So that's pushing up prices. That's causing the Fed to be more reluctant in easing monetary policy, and contributing to considerably worse consumer sentiment across all parties. I'll show you some charts on that in a minute, but that's a drag on the economy. It reduces productivity. Manufacturing activity is down, in part because a lot of U.S. manufacturers use imported parts in what they make, and then they're less competitive because they're having to charge more for what they're producing and selling in the international market. We can get into more detail on some of that. The average effective tariff rate is now 16.8%. This goes back to 1790, this chart, showing tariff rates. So until 1914 or so, tariffs were the primary source of federal government revenue. 90% of all the money that the federal government got was through customs duties. There's a great Netflix film that any of you that are political junkies, and I imagine there are a bunch in this room, would enjoy, on the life and death of President Garfield. And you can see the power and effect that tariffs and the custom office and these patronage jobs used to have in federal government. It's not the case today, of course, but tariffs have been a feature of the United States economy for a long time. The economy has done extremely well with low tariffs over an extended period of time. So you certainly introduce a lot of disruption, but the way they've been implemented and the justification for them has also been problematic. I mean, if they're used just to, oppose nations that are against us and hurting the United States, that's one thing. If you're using them with friendly countries, you know, it doesn't make sense. Also, it doesn't make sense to tariff things that we can't make ourselves. And you've seen some walk back on that, like with coffee and a few other things. But it hasn't always been that well thought out. So there's been a bit more stability, at least of late, although even within that effective rate, there have been wild changes that are regularly announced in the tariff rate. Yeah, so in addition to the tariffs, the restrictive immigration policies have negative short-term effects because they reduce the labor supply pretty substantially. There's been a dramatic cessation in new immigration, but also almost all the employment growth that we got in 2024 was foreign-born population. So you have fewer workers, so there are fewer people filling those jobs, less output, and less consumer spending from those individuals. It's really shrunk dramatically. The United States has relied on immigrant labor and immigration. It's a phenomenal benefit that few countries in the world have. Few countries in the world can attract pretty, you know, we could pick any demographic we want, and if we wanted more of whatever that demographic was and open the doors, we could get that. There's almost no place else in the world that can say that could assimilate those people. If you look at a lot of the most innovative industries, the people that have led that research, started those companies, many of them are immigrants, foreign-born. Many of you in this room don't have to go back too many generations before people in your family were immigrants as well. So there are tremendous long-term benefits, but the short-term effect is it's shrinking the labor force or slowing the growth in the labor force, and so we're getting less in the way of employment. There's some stats on that. But if we look at just year-over-year employment growth, this is total employment, and sadly, that time series ends in September. Until a few weeks, we'll get a couple more data points on that. But you can see how losing data right there. So this is year-over-year change in employment. This is the last Trump period from the first term, and then the period between that, and then since he took office and these policies went into effect. There have been two negative reads, very slight negative reads. That's, you know, not setting off fire alarms, because you always look at kind of several months in average with this. You can see it's, you know, it can bounce around a fair amount. But that, if you're looking at the overall economy, that's not a happy picture about where markets are at. And the Fed is looking at that very closely. That's why they cut rates in September. It's why they'll probably cut them again this month, but that's kind of up in the air. There's a pronounced slowing in growth. Unemployment's just ticked up a little bit, but it's rising, still relatively low. Again, when the labor supply is not growing, then it doesn't take any or very many jobs to keep unemployment from rising rapidly. So that's not yet the main concern. But it just takes off. When we quantify all this, and we work closely with Moody's Analytics, who runs larger macroeconomic models that we have input on, but we're relying on a lot of their analysis. This is their quantification of the cost of these things. So in real GDP growth, 2025 is 1.75, and 2026, 1.66. But if you take all those negative numbers from deglobalization out, you'd have more than a full percentage point of additional growth in GDP. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of tax dollars. That's a lot of impact on people's lives. And you can see how important artificial intelligence, capital investment, and then the stock wealth effects, from that. That's been really critical. Unemployment rates by state, again, August is the last data point we have, but we were still looking great in August. Vermont is almost always one of the best states in terms of unemployment, has one of the lowest unemployment rates. Inflation, however, has been problematic. The last read we had was September, and for the PCE deflator, the last read is August, and that's the deflator that the Fed uses to determine monetary policy. So both those measures ticked up in September and August, the last reads. So we'll be getting more data on that. It's probably in the same ballpark from what we can tell, but we won't know until we see the actual data. So this is Fed policy actions, the federal funds rate. You can see, drops down here and it'll go down further. And that will bring short-term rates down pretty much in sync with that. But longer-term rates, so you see that the blue line there is 30-year mortgage. Longer-term rates have not moved down as much. And that's primarily due to concern about federal deficits. And so when you think about housing affordability and things like that, the long-term rates aren't going to be super responsive to that. They'll come down some, but that's a concern with that linkage between short-term and longer-term rates. And actually, the Fed, people talk about it having a dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices. It actually has a third mandate, which is moderate long-term interest rates. And that doesn't get talked about very much because they figure if they do the first two right, the third one automatically happens. But it may not when you're running really high deficits if bond buyers are not happy with what's going on. You saw what happened when Liz Truss was running the United Kingdom economy and tried to have a budget that was just like way in the red. She lasted, I think they compared it to the shelf life of a piece of lettuce. It was very brief, let's say. Anyway, we don't know what that level is for the United States. If we look at deficit spending, there's just a lot of red ink. No matter who's in charge, Democrat, Republican, whatever, it's, always spending more seems to end up happening for different reasons. It can go up or down. And when you accumulate that over time, and this is the metric that most affects the bond markets, is debt as a percent of GDP, because that's kind of your capacity to repay the debt. That's what's really important. But you can see just how high that is. We're at the latest read about 125% of GDP. And you can take that back farther. I mean, that goes back into the 1700s. So you did have a fairly high level of debt, not this high. After World War II, there was a lot of borrowing for that, but still didn't approach these levels. The Civil War also had a big increase that was the first big increase in debt. So wars are usually thing. The pandemic here really stands out because that was dramatic and enormous increase. And then the Great Recession was big in that. So we don't know the level at which it's going to trigger some, big rise in interest rates, but it's absorbing 15% of the entire federal budget is used to pay interest on this debt. We're at about 38.4 trillion in debt as of today. So the impact on consumers and consumer sentiment is really pronounced and kind of surprising. The consumer sentiment is rarely this dour. You can see the last read here. So this is when Trump came into office. It went up. It dropped down precipitously in April. Gets to that, I can't hold this steady this far apart. Anyway, it's down in April. That's not a surprise. That was a big shock. The stock market went down. Nobody felt happy about the economy then. Since as things kind of stabilized, it went back up. But then the last three reads are down like, that's super recessionary looking consumer sentiment. That's 70% roughly of the entire economy is driven through consumer spending. So when sentiment is down, it hasn't shown up in the spending yet, but that's a problem. That's an issue we're watching closely. I had this chart in the last one, and I think it's kind of interesting because then we get another election, it gets to flip the other way. But you see even that, you know, among all groups, it's not, people aren't as happy as they were in the first Trump term. And the ones that are critical is how the independents are falling on this, because they track very closely with overall consumer sentiment. And in elections, they make the difference one way or another at a national level. That's really important. And for consumer sentiment to be that low, so this is going back, this period here was when inflation was 9%. Again, you know, nobody likes that. Everybody thought that was bad, really problematic. But sentiment now is, you know, down there, and even among Republicans is way lower than it was through most of the Trump's first term. Let's move to Q&A. How long do I have, Catherine?
Sorry,
I'm sorry, or maybe Saoirse or something.
got 15 more minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes. Yeah, let's do some Q&A. We can talk about real estate prices and other stuff. You know, real estate is an asset class that's remained strong. The only thing that's kind of interest of late in Vermont worth noting is that price increases in non-metro areas has leveled off, whereas in Burlington, it's still going up. You know, Burlington traditionally has outpaced it, but that's kind of just an interesting, the last couple data points. I'll add that the market's really thin, so the sample sizes and everything are smaller, but this is corroborated in other data sources as well. And this is a really rich database, FHFA data, that uses that. There are a zillion risks too, and we can maybe talk about that, but let's do Q&A if there are any questions.
You talked about the build-up. You talked about the build-up, if you will, due to AI, and you referenced sort of we'll see how it plays out. Do economists have any sense as to the timeline? Is this something that we'll see, whether it plays out in a year, 5 years, 10 years? Any sense of that?
You know, there have been many, many bubbles in American economic history, and the one thing I think nobody's ever been able to do is say, oh, you know, a lot of people say that's a bubble, or there's a bubble forming, or it's bubble-like or something, but what nobody's been able to do is say, that's when it's going to pop, and this is how far it's going to go. So it is hard to say. I mean, so the magnitude of it is just enormous and astounding. The things that are of most concern right now, as I look at it anyway, is the circularity of investment of producer, client, investor, owner, and participant in the whole thing has become incredibly circular. And these very, very cash-rich firms have been, spending, but now they're also leveraging. So they're borrowing money to do, even though they could do cash, they're borrowing money to do it. And when I look at the ownership of some of the data centers, it's really hard to know, like, who really owns this? If it goes under, who's left holding the bag? It's getting opaque. So that also, amplifies the potential downside risk. The other thing is the data centers don't last that long. I mean, the chips only last a few years, run the way they are. They, just run them day and night all the time. And then there are also always advancements in chips. So then you're going to be spending more and doing more. But a lot of the equipment, a lot of the money into it is maybe 5-6 year lifespan. And yet the power infrastructure, the electric power infrastructure needed to initially get all this off the ground is really more, it has like 30-year lifespan or something. So you could end up with a whole lot of stranded costs in the energy sector around it, which is part of it as well. There's just a lot of unknowns about that and a real headlong rush into it. So I wish I had a crystal ball on that one, but it's still rolling and it's global. It's actually, there's benefit to other countries and exports from the United States that are benefiting from this being a global phenomenon. But it's really too early to say. I mean, we try every new technology. I've always been interested personally in every single new technology and give it a try. And really, the early versions of AI were pretty junk, pretty worthless that in terms of immediate market use, but they have really improved in the last year. You still can't do everything you'd like, but there are more and more applications and more people are trying out different applications. When you have that scale going on, you could be figuring stuff out, pretty quickly. So I don't know, jury's out. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you ahead? Okay, we'll come back. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Thanks so much. Tom, you mentioned earlier in the presentation about corporate revenues being below target and the element about refunding, et cetera. Can you explain more about what businesses are thinking about as they're making that decision about taking that cash refund versus the alternatives that they would have?
Yeah, so, I mean, typically you would be considering whether you just want to keep that. If you're going to have a future liability, then you would simply apply your overpayment to that liability, and then you can either pay nothing later or keep paying ahead if you want to, depending. And we've seen a lot of cash out refunds have been pretty rare for the last few years. And we expected that to increase. So in the forecast, we had that. But we got a cluster of them in November, and there's some more in the pipeline in December. And so, that's just a signal. So the thinking is, if I'm not going to have a future, if I might not have a future liability, I'm not going to, leave my money at the tax department. I'll get a check back and pay later. But there's a lot of slack in estimated payments, both corporate and personal, and then actual liabilities. And so, some entities are, perennially just roll them over, others not so much. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I come back? Because I think we had one over here before that, but I'll do, yeah.
Just a quick question about your statistics. You said, I was actually kind of surprised that the wealthiest 10% own about 85% of the stock market.
Yeah.
Is that somehow I thought that the democratizing effect of pension plans was greater than that. Do those numbers include pension plans?
Yeah, they do.
Okay, thank
It's,
you.
yeah, it's not, yeah. And if you look at the liability side of the thing, you know, huge liabilities at the bottom too. And you see this in credit markets too. You see automobile repossessions are like, you know, I don't know if they're all-time highs, but they're really elevated. There's a lot of stress at the low end, and borrowing, it's showing up in low-end delinquencies and that kind of thing. So yeah, they're very much two different worlds, or maybe even 3 or 4 different worlds. But, yeah. Question?
Excuse me. Related to that, can you say a little bit more about the inflation related to what Vermonters are most directly spending money on: food, energy, housing, insurance, things like that?
Yeah. So, you know, there's sort of there are two, I think, feeling senses people have about inflation. One is, what was it like kind of before the pandemic? You know, what were prices like before all of that happened? And then there's this big increase, but then wages increased and a lot of things increased over that same period. And then there's kind of the more recent, okay, what's happened in the last year and what's going crazy? And there are different stories behind every single product that you'd have, but tariffs writ large affect lots of individual products. So motor vehicles are affected by that. And sticker prices haven't gone up nearly what the tariffs would suggest they are ultimately going to go up to, but it's affected used car prices and new car prices. It's affected insurance. It's affected auto parts. It's affected the cost of ownership around a vehicle, which is like an essential item. And you're getting pushback from consumers that can't afford more. You're getting repossessions from those that are trying to hang on to some way to get to and from work and can't. And so it's, you know, there are a lot of different ways that impacts. And if, you know, you're in a different income strata, you don't even think about it. It's like, okay, that's the insurance, I just pay it, whatever. But you're seeing people minimizing insurance by taking on more risk, not having collision or not, this kind of thing. And yeah, and then just in everyday things, like people buy coffee and the price of coffee went up and that sort of thing. Some of those will be short-term supply demand if they're, you know, things like avian flu drove up egg prices and all that. But the tariffs on a larger scale have affected a lot of different things. And so that'll seep through in different ways. But, you know, everybody has their own individual story. If you already own your home and you've got appreciation in the home and you have a low mortgage rate, you know, you're not impacted by housing prices being super high. But if you're trying to get in first time, really tough. Yeah. Yes. Oh, am I out of time? Okay. Yeah. Good. Thanks for. Well,
You
try
have
to
a
do it in
problem.
order, but I'm not seeing the whole room. Yeah. Go ahead.
You have a problem with this side of the room. No.
What's that? Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Just kidding.
You guys just haven't been asking.
I'm just wondering, you know, the number of canceled reports is alarming to me, and I'm just wondering how that has affected your work and the projections that you've made and how it might affect us in the coming session.
Well, we're tearing our hair out is what we're doing. You know, essentially, when you have a missing observation, you have to guess at it. And it's easier to guess a long time after it. You'll see a lot of information after that's actual, a lot of information before, and you can sort of splice that and say, it's probably somewhere in between. It's troublesome when you're on the edge of it. You don't have anything to splice it to. And what you're coming from is a really kind of uncertain not looking great, period. Is it getting worse? Is it staying the same? Or maybe it's getting better? And, any of those are plausible. It's hard to say. So it's a real challenge in our world, because that's where we start, is with the facts, with the numbers, and what are they telling us? And when you have radio silence, it's hard to do much. Yeah. So some of them will be released, but we're also concerned about the quality of the data for those that are released late. So I think there'll be asterisks around a lot of that if they're contradicting one another, things like that. But in our world, that's that's a big deal. Yeah, and in January we'll know a whole lot more. But as they get a bunch of them have December release dates, as you see on that chart, and so we'll see what they say. Yeah. I think our order was back here. Sorry.
Don't have to be sorry. Thank you. I'm sure I paid very close attention last year, but I don't recall. I'm referring to this slide, the revenues through October. Is this about where we were last year? Is this comparable to where we have been kind of over the last few years at this point in time? That's my first part of the question. Then second, have you projected where we might end up, or are you able to?
Yeah. It changes every year because this is relative to our forecast. Last year it was a little bit stronger, but there were some unique events that occurred, some big corporate payments and some stuff like that were lumpy. This is extraordinarily close. I mean, it's just when it's like almost right on. That's good. That's, I'd rather be right on. Actually, right on with a little bit of positive is even better. I don't think there's a normal for what's the variance through October. It's probably 50-50, pretty close, yeah. And as to where we're going to end up, we do a deep dive into all this twice a year in January and July. So that's when we'll have new consensus forecasts and all the rest. So back to the data question, we'll really be looking at the data hard for the January forecast to see if, things are tipping down and we have to lower revenue projections. There are a few events that are more like discrete events that could be big corporate with some personal income ramifications that could be upside events. I think a lot of the upside actually in the economy now is related to really elevated asset prices. So if some company gets sold, the valuations are really high, so then all that money washes down and around and over and, you get that benefit. But they're episodic, and that'll show up in personal income and corporate and stuff like that. So too early to say, but stay tuned. In January, we'll be back.
Tom, how about one more?
Okay, one more. Where are we? I think you had your hand up earlier. I'm sorry. We can talk afterwards, too.
Thank you. The Yale Budget Lab this summer put out an estimate that tariffs are going to cost the average American $2,400 a year. Does that sound right if you extrapolate that to Vermont?
Yeah, that's probably pretty close. Their latest estimate is 1,700 average, and that's in the slide deck. And they do the best job of trying to dissect all that. And that is after substitution effects. So it's, it gets complicated. So the price goes up on a tariffed good. You substitute it for something else that does the same thing but is less expensive. And so anyway, yeah, I think for low-income families, they estimated at $900 per household. And if you took that as a share of total, household budget or income, it would be a higher percentage. So it is a tax, and it's a regressive tax. Yeah. Okay, well, if there are more questions afterwards, I'll be around for a little bit, and and also Daniel Lee, who's working with us and doing some of the analysis as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tom. Next up, we have two members of the Joint Fiscal Office to help put the fiscal year 2026 budget discussion into context. This is the budget that you will be working and voting on in the coming session. Please welcome Emily Byrne, the Deputy Director and heads up the JFO budget team, and Logan Muberry, who is the Transportation Fiscal Analyst.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to talk too fast like I normally do, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time for talking too fast, but you can rewatch at half speed on YouTube later if needed. So as Catherine mentioned, we're going to talk about the FY27 budget and what to think about, maybe. Uh-oh. Tom, it worked for you. Oh, there it goes. You got to turn it on. There it goes. Okay, so we are going to talk about what you did, right? When we build the FY27 budget, we start with the FY26 budget. So we're going to start with what happened during the last legislative session. We're going to talk about what has happened since you adjourned in June. A lot has gone on the fiscal universe. And then we're going to talk about what happens next to tee it up for the FY27 budget build that you'll all be working on when you come back in January. So starting with what you did. So this slide just gives a high-level overview of appropriations since FY 2019, so right before the pandemic, so you can see how things have changed. There's been about a 5.5% growth in unduplicated appropriations. Now, I say unduplicated for those of you who are in the weeds, and for those of you that work in the global commitment space, we actually appropriate some funds twice, so just need to be clear that this is the unduplicated appropriation money spent once. So in FY26, it was $9.1 billion compared to FY25, which was $8.7 billion. It's about a 5.5% increase from FY 2019. You'll note that FY25 was actually lower than FY24. That has to do with a lot of the one-time COVID money that was running through the state budget, both federal funds, and there was a lot of one-time general fund just as a result of what was going on with people's income during the pandemic. So you did see some slowdown in spending as a result of less one-time money, but we're trending back up as usual. So of that $1.9 billion, $3.1 billion represents the federal funds. So about a third of the state budget is federal funds. That leaves about $6 billion of state funds. We have Marcia Howard from FFIS coming in to speaking to you next to talk about federal funds. For anyone who's been paying attention, there's been a lot of uncertainty around federal funds in the last 6 months. As you know, federal funds are complicated. They are sort of at the whims of what's going on with Congress and the executive branch. They are given to states with specific limitations. There are specific rules around them and how they can be spent. Sometimes there's matching requirements when we think about the transportation fund, the Medicaid program, FEMA funds, for example. Those are all matched with federal dollars to run those programs. And some programs require that we maintain a specific level of support annually as we implement those programs. So again, federal funding is always complicated. It's a big part of the budget, and right now there's a lot of uncertainty, and we'll talk more about what's happened with federal funds in a little bit. This slide should look familiar to a lot of you, and you'll probably see it again later today in some of my colleagues' presentations, but this is just as a reminder of where the money goes that you appropriate. The blue represents state funds, and the yellow represents federal funds. This just shows a breakdown by sort of sector of government of where the money is going. So you'll see that about 50% of the state budget is split between K through 12 education, which is mostly state funds, which is the education fund that we're all familiar with. And the other sort of half of that half is the Medicaid program, which is half funded with federal funds. That's a lot of halves in a row. Half funded with federal funds and half funded with state funds. So if you take, in addition to K-12 education and Medicaid, so that's about 50% of the budget, or almost nearly 60, and you add in the human services budget and the transportation budget, that's 80% of what state government does, are those four things. And the rest of state government is the remaining 20% of the budget. So if we look at just the state funds, this is mostly the general fund and the education fund. They each make up about 40% of state revenue that's spent. There's also about almost $700 million worth of special funds. Those special funds represent things like the State Parks Fund or the Child Care Contribution Special Fund, where the payroll tax goes to support childcare. Or the funds, the insurance fees that folks pay that go into funds that go to the Department of Financial Regulation. Those sort of dedicated funds is about $700 million or 12% of the state budget. The Transportation Fund and the TIB Fund make up 6% of the budget. And that last little tiny blue sliver, those are other funds, mostly enterprise funds and the pension funds. Enterprise funds are like the liquor and lottery fund that sort of fund themselves. So that's what you did in last year's budget at a very high level. But what's happened since you adjourned? We had an updated revenue forecast in July, and there's been some uncertainty and changes at the federal level, including the federal shutdown. So real quickly, I know Tom mentioned the revenue forecast and when that changes, but just for those of you that don't live, sleep, eat, breathe the budget, the revenue forecast is adopted twice every year, once in January and once in July. It's a consensus revenue forecast done by an economist hired by the administration and an economist hired by the legislature. They come together, present a revenue forecast to the emergency board. It's adopted by the emergency board, and that sort of becomes the North Star, if you will, for the budget build. So the budget that you built last spring was based off of the revenue forecast that was adopted in July. We then had another revenue forecast, or that was adopted in January, excuse me. We had another revenue forecast that was adopted in July. And the next couple slides I'm going to go through reference sort of how each of those major funds revenues have changed since the July forecast was adopted. So if I refer to a downgrade, it's compared to the January forecast. And if I refer to an upgrade, it's also referred to the January forecast, just in the other direction. So on the general fund side, we did have an upgrade in general fund revenue in July as compared to January. So that's good news for the budget adjustment process. It means that there's more general fund available to be appropriated in the FY26 budget adjustment. It was about $77 million, or 3.2% of the general fund. The majority of that growth was in the personal income tax. The consumption taxes, on the other hand, so sales and use, meals and rooms, purchase and use, are not seeing the same level of growth as personal income tax. They're starting to soften. Additionally, I'll just point out on this one, healthcare revenue. It's not a section of the general fund budget that gets talked about a lot, but about half of that healthcare revenue is represented by a thing called the provider tax. Without going too far into the weeds, the provider tax is levied on healthcare providers. We draw down the tax, we then match those taxes with federal funds, and then pay those same providers Medicaid dollars. Part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed by the feds back in July was a change to the rate that states are allowed to pay for the provider tax. It doesn't start to decrease, there's a step down in the rate that states are allowed to charge. That's going to go into effect not in the for the FY27 budget, but for the FY28 budget, and it steps down over a 5-year period. There'll be more conversation by my colleagues about healthcare, but that's just something to keep in the back of your head, is that revenue stream specifically is going to have to decrease over the next several years as a result of changes in federal policy. That's the general fund. This is just a high-level overview of how general fund revenues have tracked since 1998. I don't know why we picked 1998, but we did. And this shows that the blue line is nominal dollars, so how the revenue has changed over time. It has grown, but when we adjust that for inflation, you see that red line, there really hasn't been that much growth or real change in purchasing power of those dollars. And the projections out for the next 5 years based on the revenue forecasts are really a flat, adjusted for a flat amount of growth in revenues. real quick on the transportation fund. Again, my colleague Logan Muberry, who's the transportation fund analyst, is going to speak more about this when it's his turn. But the transportation fund was downgraded $7.5 million in July as compared to the January revenue forecast, or about 2.3%. That triggered a rescission process. And what a rescission process does is that the Agency of Transportation and Finance and Management presented a plan to the Joint Fiscal Committee to reduce spending from the Transportation Fund in September at the Joint Fiscal meeting, so that they are in line with projected revenues. Most of the reduction in revenue anticipated in the Transportation Fund was in purchase and use tax and the DMV fees. The Education Fund, the non-property tax revenue in the Education Fund also saw a very small downgrade of 0.5% or $3.7 million. Again, it has nothing to do with the property taxes. It's the sales and use tax, meals and rooms, about a third of the Education Fund revenues that were downgraded. The Education Fund doesn't have a rescission process. Those deficits are managed by the stabilization reserve in the Education Fund, and you will deal with refilling that stabilization reserve in the next budget process. So to talk specifically about federal changes that have happened in the last 6 months, again, I'll very high level, since there'll be a more deep dive on federal action by FFIS, and then some more conversation this afternoon from the healthcare team about what's going on with the healthcare specifically. But I'll call it the OBBB. I heard that at NCSL, and that's an easy way to remember this. But the Federal Reconciliation Act included lots of changes to several federal programs and how they're implemented by the states and how they're funded. This included the Medicaid program and some other healthcare programs, and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, or as in Vermont, it's called Three Squares Vermont. There were also some changes to the federal income tax code, which may impact Vermonters, but we're not going to get into the details on that. So in Medicaid, very quickly, there are the change in the OBBB added work requirements for Medicaid eligibility, changed when redeterminations need to happen, so reapplying for Medicaid coverage from annually to every 6 months. It limited the ability to get retroactive coverage. It did establish the Rural Health Transformation Grant, which the state has applied for. We haven't heard back from the federal government on what that award is yet. I think by the end of the month, we'll hear. And it changes to the provider tax, as I mentioned. For the context of the FY27 budget, not all of these things are necessarily going to impact the 27 budget. However, the Agency of Human Services is going to have to be able to implement these things in the coming years. So likely in the 27 budget, you'll see money to go to those agencies to set up the administrative infrastructure that's going to be needed to implement work requirements and to do redeterminations more frequently. For SNAP, again, this is the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or Three Squares Vermont. One of the changes in the SNAP program that will impact the budget is there is a change in how the administrative costs are paid. Historically, it was a 50-50 split between state and federal government. That has shifted from a 75 state share to a 25% federal share. That's about an additional $8.4 million of additional costs to the state budget that we will have to plan for and absorb. Additionally, there were some changes to eligibility for the SNAP program, and there is another component of changes related to how states have to cost share in the benefit if their error rate is high. Without going into too much detail, if the error rate in a state is exceeds 6%, then the state has to pay 5% of the benefit cost. There's actually a ladder upward. The higher your error rate is, the more the state has to pay into the program. As of FY24, Vermont's error rate was 5.13%, so we're below that 6% threshold, and we don't have a state cost share. However, if there are, the error rate can be impacted by overpayments, underpayments, or incorrect client information from beneficiaries. So there are some things that can change that error rate, and that's something to watch in the future so that we can mitigate whether or not the state will have to cost share in the SNAP program. At the end of the FY26 budget build, it looked like we knew that income taxes were coming in higher than forecast. So in the Appropriations Act, you all included a couple contingent appropriations in anticipation of that additional revenue coming to the state. Also, I think there was some awareness of changes at the federal level that were coming that were likely to impact the state budget. So what was decided in the appropriations bill was that excess money that was coming into the state would be set aside specifically for managing potential changes to federal programs while you were all out of session. So $50 million was set aside. It was actually appropriated to the Secretary of Administration solely for the purpose of being transferred by the emergency board in the event of a loss of federal funds. In addition, there was $30 million reserved specifically for federal funding shortfalls that could be accessed by the General Assembly when they come back into session. And then there was another $30 million that was also for federal funding shortfalls or other stuff. So there's $30 million that's just for federal funds and another $30 million that's for federal funds or other things that come up. You may all be aware that one of the things that changed during the federal shutdown was the federal government instructed states not to issue SNAP benefits in November initially. On October 28th, the emergency board met and decided to appropriate $6.55 million of the $50 million that was set aside for federal fund shortfall. $250,000 was directed to the Vermont Food Bank and community food shelves to provide food, funding for food for the time period between November 1st, when the benefit would not be issued, and when the state would be able to issue its own state-level benefit. The emergency board also appropriated $6.3 million to the Department for Children and Families. That was for a state-level benefit that was paid to individuals who receive SNAP benefits to cover about 15 days worth of the SNAP benefit in anticipation of the federal government releasing the funds. The federal government ultimately did release the November benefit, but it was about 2 weeks late. So of the $50 million, $45.45 million of that appropriation remains unallocated, or 87%. So what happens next? You're going to build the FY27 budget with sort of all of that context, federal uncertainty that's going on right now. Just as the most important reminder, right, that budget has to be balanced. The sources will have to equal the uses in the FY27 budget. Just as a reminder, I know I said we're going to talk about the 27 budget, and there's a slide with a title that says one-time money in the FY26 budget. The reason I wanted to talk about the FY26 budget is the one-time money in the context of FY27 is there was about $200 million of one-time money spent in the FY26 budget. As you look to the FY27 budget, there may be some items on this list that you may need to reconsider as whether or not they were truly one-time in 26 or they will repeat as another one-time expense in FY27. Specifically, the $77 million that was used to stabilize property tax rates last year, that was considered one-time money in the FY26 budget. My colleague Julia Richter will talk more about the education fund and what's going on there later this afternoon. Additionally, there was over $30 million used for GA emergency housing that was considered one-time money that will likely need to be revisited in the FY27 budget. The Department of Finance and Management issued budget instructions to agencies and departments in August, and the goal of those budget instructions are to provide guidance to state government on how to build their budgets. And every department and agency in state government then submits a budget to the Commissioner of Finance and Management for review by the governor as the governor puts together his proposed budget. The instructions this year directed agencies and departments to increase base spending by no more than 3%. While that is a growth for agencies and departments, it's important to note that the PAY Act, or the bill that provides salary and salary-related benefit increases to state employees, was on average 5.4% increase last year. The instructions also included that departments and agencies should assume a 5% increase in the healthcare benefit for state employees and a 3% average increase for the internal service funds. 3%, while an increase over prior years when the underlying pressures in your budget are growing by more than 3%, results in agencies and departments probably having to make decisions about where to reduce spending. And we will likely see that in the budget that's presented by the governor. There are some other things to consider in terms of building the budget. I'm not going to talk about each of these things. You can read them if you would like to, but I'll point out a few that are important. So there's still the federal funding uncertainty and the implementation of the OBBB. Unfunded liabilities, maybe I'm going to read all of them. Inflationary pressures, we're all aware, as Tom spoke about, there is inflation. It does impact agencies and departments, both in terms of their need to buy things to do their jobs, like pave the roads, as well as inflationary pressures when they give out grant funds, those entities have inflationary pressures and the dollar is not necessarily going as far. Transportation funding that Logan will speak in more detail about. There's always caseload and program pressures in areas like Medicaid and choices for care. Julia will talk more about education finance later this afternoon. Homelessness and the opioid epidemic, the cost of the state workforce, the implementation of IT projects in state government, federal match, climate change and disaster, anticipating the next natural disaster, and the perennial demographic and workforce challenges that we face. I wanted to include a slide about the state reserves. It's important for you all to know that the reserves are in a good place. They're healthy. They're not available for discretionary use, but they're there in case they're needed. At the close of FY25, there was about $330 million in the general fund reserved, in the education fund about a little over $50 million, and in the transportation fund around $23 million. And the last thing I'll leave you with, I think when I think about this year's budget and the challenges that you all are going to face in building it, it's likely going to be the intersection of the three major funds. So we have these three major funds and we think about them sort of in their own silos, if you will, right? And there's a kind of a wall between all of them. But I like to think about it more as a chain link fence. Right? You see a chain link fence, you generally like, okay, that's a barrier and I don't go through it. But at the end of the day, you could feed things through the chain link fence. You can also climb over a chain link fence if you had to. So while we're trying to manage sort of the federal challenges and the pressures on the general fund, there's also going to be this intersection between these other funds. Logan will talk more about the transportation fund, but one example of this in last year's budget was there had historically been a long time spending of transportation fund dollars on state police costs. In last year's budget, we removed that change. The state police costs shifted back to the general fund, and what that did was released $20 million of transportation funds to be spent on roads and bridges and other transportation projects. Similarly, last year, there was $77 million of general funds that was deposited into the education fund to buy down property taxes. This sort of fluidity it happens, and it's just important to keep in the back of your mind that there's sort of that chain link fence. If you have to climb over it, you can, but I think the big challenge this year will be thinking about sort of all three of those big roles of government and how they intersect with each other. And with that, I will leave you with that and go over to Logan to talk about the transportation fund.
All right, good morning. My name is Logan Mouberry. I got a couple slides to talk to you about the transportation fund. Quick overview, we're going to look at the transportation fund year end. We'll see how the transportation fund is doing so far. And then we're going to talk some big picture transportation funding issues that we've been seeing over the past few years. So transportation year end in fiscal year 25, the transportation fund ended $7.4 million below the forecast estimate, and revenue shortfalls were due to underperformance in the purchase and use and the DMV fees, which you can see there. This led us to the July revenue forecast, which, as was mentioned, downgraded the transportation fund in FY26 and beyond. The downgrade was a result from a reduction in projected purchase and use and DMV fees, which you can see there on this chart. I also want to point out on the right-hand column there, the forecasted growth over the 5 years for these different funds. You can see both gas and diesel tax are forecasted to be declining through 2030. The other fees, purchase and use, is growing the most, but for a total transportation fund growth of only 1.33%. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Because the forecast downgraded the T-fund revenues, as Emily mentioned, we have to do a rescission plan. So AOT came up with a plan you can see here on the screen. This was presented to the Joint Fiscal Committee, which adopted this and brought the FY26 budget in alignment with the new forecast. And then looking at the transportation fund as it has been this year, so this is July through October, we'll see that revenues continue to underperform even against that lowered July forecast. And this is largely coming from the purchase and use tax, which is remaining sluggish. And this is the trend that we've seen going back to February of last year. So now I want to jump to some of the larger transportation revenue challenges that we've seen over the past few years and talk about some of these issues. The big one being, as I just highlighted, that revenues are stagnant and are not keeping up with inflation. So improved fuel efficiency, increased electrical vehicle adoption has led to a gradual decline in our gasoline consumption and therefore the gas tax revenue. This is a trend unlikely to continue. This is why we saw the gas tax forecasted to be decreasing in the future. Also, demographic constraints limit growth in vehicle purchases and registrations, which is leading to flat fee revenues. And as I had just mentioned, the July 25 forecast is predicting a 1.33% growth between 2026 and 2030, which is below what we've been seeing for recent inflation levels. Also, cost pressures are increasing far faster than transportation revenues are growing. The National Highway Construction Cost Index has seen a growth since 2020 of 62%. And in addition, the transportation industry has also seen growth in the salaries and benefits, which represents a significant cost pressure on the transportation fund. This chart looks at the transportation fund. So the green line is the revenues from 2013 going out then to 2030. And the red line is if we adjust those for inflation and bring them into 2013 dollars. What you see here is that today, or at FY26, we're about where we were in 2013. And if you follow the projection out to 2030, and if the forecast is accurate, we will actually be below where we were as far as purchasing power than we were in 2013. This next chart also looks at inflation, a different view. This is the percent change in the transportation fund revenues compared to that National Highway Construction Cost Index. You'll see the orange line is the change in T-fund revenues since 2010, so the growth there, which is around 50% since 2010. And then the green line is the change in the National Highway Construction Cost Index, which you'll notice in 2021 saw a massive increase due to inflation, which is a significant increase in cost to do the main thing in transportation, which is construction. Additionally, as Emily had mentioned, we know that federal funds are a big part of the budget in transportation, even more so. Roughly 51% of funding last year was federal funding. To draw down these funds, Vermont must be able to contribute a state match portion. Currently, it's roughly 83% federal to 17% non-federal or state funds that we need to bring down. And beginning in fiscal year 27, there's projected to be a state match deficit of $33.4 million, which could threaten the state's ability to match $163 million in funding. In fiscal year 28, that is expected to increase as well. In addition, federal match is not the only thing we spend our state dollars on. We still have many other funding needs, such as town highway aid, climate resiliency, and general maintenance. So the last point here, If Vermont does not have the revenue to maximize its federal dollars and to keep up with maintenance, capital needs, infrastructure will deteriorate and cost more in the future. Backlogs are often difficult to dig out of. They require years of sustained additional investment, and infrastructure is always deteriorating. This is a chart of that federal funds and state match outlook, which I just referenced. In the FY27 column, you can see the projected state match deficit of $33.4 million. And then this is one example of one area of transportation which is being impacted by revenue constraints. This is a forecasted paving conditions. So in fiscal year 26, this year, we budgeted $103 million for projected paving throughout the state. AOT estimates that if we continue to pave at this level of investment, by 2030, 60% of Vermont's roads will be in poor or very poor conditions. And then lastly, I just wanted to leave you all with some of the things that we have done in the past to help fund transportation. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the things that we've done. I won't go through all of these. I'll just make a note of the substantial federal funding that we have received over the past few years has allowed us to do a lot of work that we might otherwise not be able to. We've used that money to good purposes. In FY24, we increased DMV fees, raising $20 million. We have set aside over 3 years $45 million to be used as one-time match for that state funding, as well as to free up some other money in other projects. And then lastly, as was mentioned, was the elimination of that JTOC transfer that was going to state police out of the T fund will now be taken over by the general fund. With that, I don't know if we have time.
Why don't we do, if there's one or two questions, and we are also going to be here for the whole session, so you can also reach out. Are there any questions? Yes.
About this or about Emily's presentation?
Either one.
About Emily's presentation, about the provider tax. Hold on, let me go back to that slide. Where was it? I can't find the slide that you talked about, Emily, but about the provider tax. When we, from my understanding right now, it's at 6% and it's going to go to 3.5%. What does Vermont charge different provider taxes for different services that contribute to that half of the healthcare revenue? Do you have that information on hand?
That's a good question. I think we'll find that and we'll make sure Nolan mentions it this afternoon when we talk
And
about
there's
healthcare.
also, remind me, in OB3, there were exemptions made to certain long-term care facilities and things like that that would be exempt from that provider tax going down, correct, or no?
I'm not sure. I'll find out.
Okay, thank you.
One more? Would you want more? Yeah.
This is a question for Logan, but I can wait. Thanks. Thank you. Logan, just on looking at the transportation revenues and seeing that purchase and use continues to come in lighter than expected, and that's from purchasing new and used vehicles, from my understanding, and knowing that both federal incentives for electric vehicle purchases and state incentives have gone away. Have you all done any analysis in terms of looking at what Vermont as a state was contributing to EV incentives, and now that we're not contributing any, like, is there any correlation between if we were to continue or restart EV incentives, would we be able to boost that purchase and use, those fees up again? And we did hear some testimony last year that, car dealers were saying that the incentives were certainly significant in their, in their sales.
Sure, yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And I do know that when the reduction of the incentives or the elimination of the incentives was announced, there was a sort of front buying of these vehicles to make use of that incentives. So to the extent that that would impact the purchase and use, I can't say what it would be, but it would probably have some impact in incentivizing purchases. But I couldn't say for sure how much or how little that would actually be.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Emily and Logan. And again, they're here. They will be here today, and they're here during the session. So if you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to them. Now we're lucky to have Marcia Howard. She's the Executive Director and Executive Editor of the Federal Funds Information for the States. She's on Zoom. FFIS, which you all may see the emails from them, is an important organization that provides valuable information on the impact of federal budgeting decisions to the states. And please join me in welcoming Marcia.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. It's a bigger pleasure when I'm there in person, but I'm happy to be with you, and I'm going to try to not keep you from your lunch for too long, or your lunch break anyway. Just go over some current status of state federal affairs, which, this week is pretty quiet, but hasn't been quiet up till now and may not be quiet tomorrow. So let's get after it. There are 4 things that I want to touch on today. One is 2025 discretionary spending status, which you may want to think about and say, wait a second, that fiscal year is over. But it's not really over. It isn't over till it's over. And even then, it's not really over. And the 2025 reconciliation implementation, and I won't go into much detail on that, but luckily Emily did, and I think you'll have more on that later. The 2026 fiscal year budget update, and then just taking a bit of a long-term view of 2027 and beyond, and some of the things that will inform state-federal fiscal relations at that time. And you will notice a good deal of overlap in things you heard from both Tom and Emily in what I'm saying. So there are some themes here that are emerging. So just to give the backdrop to where we've been this year, these are 5 things that have really been priorities for this administration. And I think, you clearly have seen them from your vantage points, both as legislators and as just citizens. But it's to cut federal taxes, to cut federal mandatory spending, sometimes called entitlement spending, to cut the discretionary grants going to state and local governments, to shrink the federal government's footprint generally, but at the same time to vastly expand the power of the executive branch vis-a-vis the legislative branch. And it has succeeded in doing all of these things to some degree, and it turns out that it has a rather impressive toolbox available to it in pursuing these policies. So the first set of blocks here that are colored in yellow or gold are things that any new administration does when it comes into office. They're quite typical and quite normal. They issue executive orders. They can restructure departments and lay off people. They can issue regulations and repeal regulations from the previous administration. They put out guidance. We talked a little bit more about spending plans, but spending plans are just what the agencies put together to say how they're going to spend the dollars that were appropriated to them. And they can pause funding because it's midway through a fiscal year. And so, they may want to pause some of what had been priorities from the previous administration. So those are all pretty typical, normal, and they happen all the time. The next 4 in red are the ones where we've seen unusual amounts of activity in this administration relative to those that have come before, and areas where they have vastly, or at least marginally, expanded the executive branch's role in these things, and also areas where there have been legal challenges to a lot of what they've done. So that's in the area of rescinding funds that have already been appropriated to states and other agencies, to claw them back, to cancel grants that were already in the works, to eliminate programs during the fiscal year without congressional approval. And then, of course, in the shutdown, we saw the executive branch really step into the breach of what was going to happen while the federal government was shut down. So all 4 of these are, as I say, areas where there's been some litigation, but also areas where in the past, Congress might have played some role in at least consulting, if not approving these things, although approving them is in general what they would have done. But that just hasn't happened so much this time, although a rescission package was approved. And then the last two, reconciliation and FY 2026 appropriations, are just flat out legislature has to be involved. Congress has to be in on those processes. But these are all the tools that we've really seen employed over the last 11 months. Now, I mentioned that 25 is over, but not really over. The reason that 2025 is still open in a lot of ways, the main reason, is that you may recall that when they adopted a budget for the fiscal year 2025, they did it very late in the fiscal year. And what they ended up doing, it was early in this new administration, I believe it was March, is they passed a full year continuing resolution. So there wasn't a budget bill. The budget bill is just a bill to say, we're doing everything we did last year. The numbers are the same, with some tweaks. And the reason that set things up for chaos in a way is that usually when a budget bill gets enacted, it's not just the budget bill, but it's kind of a package. And the legislation will say, everything in this bill is the law, but so is the explanatory statement that accompanies this bill, and so are all the committee reports that accompany all the appropriations bills that passed the House or the Senate. So you've got this bundle of additional material that gives the specificity to the appropriations that you need, or to know exactly how much each individual program is going to get. Because the appropriation bill itself, I'll take the example of the Education Department, there's an account called Innovation and Improvement. So the appropriation bill may appropriate funds for that account, but it doesn't include how much goes to each program that's in that account. And there may be a dozen programs in that account. So in 2025, we didn't have that. We didn't have that level of detail for what each program was getting. And of course, these are grant programs going to states, and we're in the business of telling you how much you're getting. And we don't know because there's nothing there that tells us. And so the bill required agency spending plans to provide that level of specificity. And if those agency plans were submitted to Congress, they were never made public. So we've never seen them. So this whole kind of uncertainty and openness, flexibility, I guess, is one way of looking at it, really allowed the executive branch discretion to do a lot of things, and they did a lot of things. And what this has led to, and Tom talked about this in terms of the economic statistics, but missing data and other challenges. I mean, and for us, it's the budget data, where we just don't have what we would typically have for fiscal year 2025. So even though the year is over, to us, it's very much still in play. And speaking of these data sources, we have the ones we usually use in our work, and this is a list of some of them, and we just keep coming up short on these. And so I talked about the explanatory statements, but there wasn't one because of the full year CR. The agency spending plans we never saw. Then when the president finally put out a 2026 budget proposal, and I think that was in June that came out, usually there's a whole volume of that called Analytical Perspectives. And Analytical Perspectives, among other things, had a whole chapter on aid to state and local governments that included grant allocations proposed and actual for the current year, proposed for the budget year, for about 45, significant grant programs. In 2026, they did not publish Analytical Perspectives, so we lost that. Then as the budget moves through the congressional process, you get the congressional justifications, and it's like for you, when the agency comes to make its case before you to tell you how much it needs and what it's going to do with it. In the case of the federal government, these congressional justifications frequently will have either state detail for the current budget year on many grant programs, And what it will usually include is the 2025 enacted level. But what we found this year is that the congressional justifications didn't have as many of the 50 state tables. And in some cases, they were completely absent of 2025 data at all. So again, coming up short. And then finally, moving through the committee reports as these appropriations bills are getting approved in Congress, in the House and the Senate. They just they'll have what it was in 2024 and what they're approving for 2026 and just nothing for 2025. So it's been a challenge to say the least. In summary, then, we still have some unknowns, and your staff or in the executive branch have certainly noticed that the notice of funding opportunities for a lot of programs were clawed back early in this administration, and they put a pause on certain programs. And then what we found is after a month or two, they started to reissue some of those NOFOs with different criteria for assessing. These are mostly competitive grants. But because they had been delayed by the clawback, the applications periods were really, really short. And so it's been a challenge for states to try to get some of this money. And then we have this whole issue of impoundment of the administration holding back funding for certain grants without congressional approval to do so. That's being litigated. The Government Accountability Office says it's not legal. There's a law that speaks to it specifically, but because it's being litigated, it's not getting reversed. And so, the question becomes, will the clock just run out on these programs as court decisions are made and then appealed and made and appealed and so on and so on. You had some discussion earlier with Emily on the reconciliation package. I don't have much to say about it, except that, reconciliation is a powerful process with a narrow scope. And it was used for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was signed into law on July 4th. And it did do a number of things, including both increasing and reducing mandatory spending, modifying mandatory programs that include Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, and SNAP, rescinded a bunch of Inflation Reduction Act, which was the climate law, rescinding unobligated balances and repealing tax provisions from that law, and also canceling or eliminating grant programs that had been in that law. It extended large parts of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act from the first Trump administration. It also started, of course, new tax breaks for tipped income, overtime pay, and car loan interest. Those three are all time limited in this bill. I think they're all 3-year tax breaks. And then importantly, it raised the debt limit. And I can't even remember I think it raised it by an amount rather than to a period of time. So now we start the 2026 budget cycle, which got off to a late start because the president's budget came out in June, when it usually, by statute, would come out in February, but never does in the first year of a new president's term, and almost never does, period. So the president's budget had proposed significant reductions, including the elimination of 193 grant programs that go to state and local governments worth $107 billion, to just eliminate completely. And then in the House, there's kind of an agreement with the spirit of that, but not the letter of it. So the House goes along with some of these cuts, but not as many. And so what you see is a slight, I think it's about a 6% reduction in spending for grants on state and local governments. There were or are in the House bills notable cuts to Title I grants for education, for HIV/AIDS, for refugee assistance in HHS, and for the Department of Labor Workforce Investment Act programs. And then on the Senate side, the Senate just is sort of doing its own thing like it often does and marching to the beat of its own drummer. And its bills are almost all very close to level funding from the current year with no really significant cuts. But what's notable about the Senate bills, especially in contrast to the House bills, apart from not cutting spending, is that they're bipartisan. And so they're moving through that chamber with both Republican and Democratic support, which in this day and age is something that's not common. We're currently operating under a continuing resolution that runs until January of next year. We all went through the SNAP problem during the shutdown in October. That problem is solved because the agriculture bill has been enacted, so SNAP is good for the whole fiscal year. But if we should get to another shutdown, I think it will be Medicaid that will have you on the edges of your seats, because Medicaid funding was funded for the first quarter in last year's appropriation bill. So it was good until December in any case. This time it's only going to have a 30-day cushion. So it would just be through February. So, depending on what happens, that would be the risk that we would see. Just to, put a highlight on the fact that you do need bipartisan support in the Senate, because as of today anyway, the Senate has a filibuster. And so you need 60 votes to proceed on legislation. So it's harder to get severe policies through the Senate. And then the last thing is that we went through this reconciliation process for 2025, and they've gone back and forth on 2026. So it's just not clear whether they're going to pursue reconciliation again. And again, I say reconciliation is limited, right, to taxes and mandatory programs. So if it is undertaken, they have said it will likely address health reform and or tariff policy. So we'll just have to see, because every week there's a different conventional wisdom around that. In terms of the appropriations process, this just summarizes where things are. P means it passed the whole chamber. C means it passed at the committee level. Enacted means it's a done deal, and a blank means nothing's happened. So you can see it's a little bit of a patchwork. And what we noticed in these congressional bills that have moved through is that, especially in the Senate, blistering language about what the administration has done. This, kind of stepping into the breach and doing what they want and pulling things back and redirecting funds and closing departments and closing field offices and all of it. Like we on our staff, we were like keeping, tally of who could find the most strong language in the Senate reports condemning what the administration had been doing. So there is some pushback. And as I said, if things get enacted in regular order, those reports become binding on the legislation that appropriates funds. So they're trying to put some teeth in it. It's just not clear whether or not the teeth actually bite, because this administration has sort of, said, okay, whatever, and continued to do what it wanted to do in the first place. And the House legislation is much less vehement, but it does sort of have the same sentiment in certain cases. Then there are other issues that we're, keeping a lookout for. One is, of course, this issue of data quality and availability that Tom talked about. It's a problem. They're discontinuing certain products. They're delaying certain things. I don't know if any of you look at our state policy reports where we do an index of state economic momentum. But for the first time since I've been doing it, which is about since 2000 probably, we won't be putting it out in December because we're probably not going to have either the employment data or the personal income data that we need to do it. So it's real, this problem. And they talk about radical transparency, and what we're seeing instead is radical opacity, because there's just, and as I said, this 2025 spending data, nothing. We're looking for, more funding cuts to see if they'll do more rescissions, whether the Supreme Court will have something to say about this, and whether we'll have reconciliation in 2026. And then finally, and Emily mentioned this as well, we've got our eyes on FEMA. Clearly there's something going on there. And are they going to just cherry pick how they spend money like they're doing now on sort of a case-by-case basis? or will there be some more comprehensive effort to reform the disaster relief program? And we'll see. They've been proposing it for many years. It's not a new problem. What's new is that they're just kind of doing it without a change in policy. And then this is the part where just to get a little more focus on what the future looks like. So this is the Congressional Budget Office projection of federal revenues and outlays in 2026, the current year. So you can see, you know, there's a $2 trillion plus gap there between revenues on the left and outlays on the right, 5.1 versus 7.3. And then taking even a longer view, questions about what did this reconciliation bill from the summer, what was its impact on the long-term deficit? So if you look at the blue line on the bottom that says January 2025 baseline, that's what CBO thought the deficit projection, or that was the deficit projection at that time, going out to 2034. Then that was revised as a result of enacting the reconciliation bill. And the orange line on top is what the deficit projections look like now, post-reconciliation. So as you can see, the reconciliation bill has in fact added to the deficit projection for each and every year, which means it's also adding to the national debt each and every year. And that means that interest costs keep going up. So these are the projections of what the net interest on the debt is in each year going out to 2034. So the interest alone is, you know, slated to more than, well, about double, from 881 billion in 2024 to 1.8 trillion, more than double, by 2034. So, and part of that too is that interest rates themselves, right? We went a long period, 20, 30 years, where interest rates were so low that the net interest on the debt wasn't a huge burden on the annual operating budget, but it is now. So that's something that's going to inform future budgets. So where things stand, we look back at where we've been, and 2025 still has loose ends, big program and tax changes that you'll be talking about more in the rest of the day. And we're waiting for federal guidance on a lot of these. So your states are, you know, moving along as quickly as you can, but in some cases it's the lack of federal guidance that is holding you up. And as I said, it's just not clear if some of the things this administration has done will be ruled unlawful, and if ruled unlawful, will be reversed. Where we are right now is in a continuing resolution, and obviously this fiscal year, until the budget's passed, it holds peril. We don't know if there will be more rescissions, eliminations, consolidations, shutdowns. We do know, of course, in the Department of Education that that's very much live and happening, so there's that. To emphasize always that bipartisan support is needed to enact a budget, to get it through the Senate, and that if there's a shutdown, the administration has shown its willingness to step into the breach and to take dramatic actions to implement policies that it favors. And then taking the longer view, we don't know how these impoundment court cases will play out because the court system moves slowly. And we don't know if the fiscal condition of the nation will lead to kind of a change in mindset and fiscal policy, especially as it affects state governments. So that's a big unknown. We have here a list of our resources that you can use to see information on all of these subjects that we track and try to help you understand. And then finally, this is just our contact and our mailing list and stuff. If you aren't getting our materials and you'd like to, this is how you get them. So that is it for me. And do I have time for questions, or, oh, it's a minute to noon. You guys decide.
Yeah. Are there any questions at all? Does anybody have? I think we are good. Marcia, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Marcia for her. Thank you all. As I mentioned, all of these information resources are on our webpage. We can get them to you. Go enjoy lunch and we'll see you at 1.